We have newly released evidence from a murder mystery. A woman was found dead inside her home, a bungee cord around her neck. The victim's son claims someone came into the house in the small town outside St. Louis and killed a beloved member of the community. She was a mayor's widow. She became known as a waitress who would donate her tips to charity. So the big question was, who would want her dead? We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. I'm going to take you inside a story that shocked a small Midwestern town. We have newly released evidence photos that will help paint the picture of what happened. It was a murder mystery because the victim in this case seemed like the last person that anyone would ever have a problem with. That person is Norma Caraker. She was 60 years old and she lived inside this house in Troy, Illinois. It's a community about a half hour outside of St. Louis. It's a town of a little more than 10,000 people, and Caraker seemed like the kind of person everyone knew. Her obituary read that she never met a stranger and she took care of her family and friends. She was also a local waitress who made a name for herself because she would donate her tips to charity. So it was a huge shock when police in Madison County, Illinois, responded to Norma's house and found her unresponsive in her bed. These are the pictures that we've just received showing some of the evidence that police found at the scene. We have blurred parts of these pictures where there is blood on the mattress. The pictures show her house does have some clutter all around, but it's unclear if that clutter is because of a struggle that she may have had with an attacker. Now, this is the biggest piece of evidence though. Look at this here. Police found this inside Norma's home. It is a bungee cord. In fact, they found it around her neck in her bed when officers responded to her home. Police took dozens of pictures inside the home, trying to piece together what this case would look like and trying to figure out who would want this 60-year-old woman dead. Prosecutors say the night that Norma was killed, she went on a date. She had been a widow since 2018. Her husband used to be the mayor of the town before he passed. From the outside of the home, it didn't appear that someone had broken in. We do have pictures showing windows are closed, doors in the house all seem to be in good shape, suggesting that the killer didn't need to force their way into the house. There was clutter inside the home, but nothing that suggested there was some long, drawn-out fight in multiple rooms. The only place that was truly disheveled was the bedroom, and that is where Norma was found. In that bedroom, there was blood on the floor, blood on the mattress, her pillow as well, and that bungee cord that was wrapped around her neck. That, police say, was the murder weapon. The person who called 911 to tell police that their mom was unresponsive was Norma's son, Neil. Here's a picture from his Facebook. He lived in his mom's basement. The Bellevue News-Democrat reported that Neil told police that he saw an unknown man run out of the sliding glass door in the home before he found his mom on the bed unresponsive. Here's a picture of that door that he said that she ran out of. When police investigated, they noticed that the door was locked, meaning if someone was to run out of that door, they wouldn't have had time to lock it. The newspaper also wrote that Neil was visibly drunk, according to police. Police said that the story that Neil was giving them just didn't add up, and Neil Howard was arrested for allegedly killing his own mom. So what would drive someone to kill their own mother, especially in a way that appeared to be as brutal as doing it with a bungee cord in her bed? Prosecutors would argue at trial that Neil hated that his mom was out dating. Prosecutors argued that Neil killed Norma shortly after she returned home from a date, wrapping that bungee cord around her neck in her bed. The prosecuting attorney said in their closing argument that Norma's dating was making Howard, quote, angrier and angrier and angrier until he got drunk enough that he couldn't take it anymore. The other part of the motive, according to prosecutors, was money. The prosecutor said, quote, this defendant had had enough of his mother, he'd had enough of her sleeping around, he'd had enough of her not giving him money. But this was not an open and shut case. Howard's defense said that police didn't bother getting a DNA sample from that man who Norma had been on a date with that night until 15 months after her murder. Beyond that, a crime lab technician for the defense testified that DNA on the bungee cord and beneath Norma's fingernails came back to match the man who Norma had been on a date with, according to the newspaper. Well, if you're like me, you do care about what you put into your body, but finding high quality groceries at an affordable price can be really hard. That is where Thrive Market comes in. Thrive Market is a great online grocery store where you can shop for healthy and sustainable products, all delivered right to your door. Really, the best part is Thrive Market does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. It restricts over 1,000 questionable ingredients from all of the products they carry. This is one product I really like right now. It's a little over $5. These organic date pops, these ones come in cinnamon bun flavors. They're really tasty, great energy bites to help get you through the day. With Thrive Market, you can shop everything from pantry staples and snacks to personal care items, all from the comfort of your own home. Plus, their commitment to sustainability means not only are you taking care of yourself, but you're taking care of the planet as well. They have a website that is super easy to use and an app. You can filter by dietary preferences. Maybe you're keto, gluten-free, vegan, or just trying to make healthier swaps like I am. Thrive Market has something for you. So if you're ready to make healthy shopping as easy as just a few clicks, check out Thrive Market. You can scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description of this video, or go to thrivemarket.com/onthecase. You'll get 30% off your first order and a free gift when you join. Howard's fiance and his sister stood by his side. They argued that police jumped the gun in targeting Neil Howard, and they said to the News Democrat newspaper that they were not expecting a guilty verdict. But guilty is what the jury came back with. Howard was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the strangulation murder of his own mom. The judge said that Howard will have to serve the entire 30-year sentence. He would be 76 years old if he ever stepped foot outside of prison. His defense has said they plan to appeal the ruling. Joining us now is certified criminal trial attorney Michael Korobanix. Thank you, sir, for taking the time, as always, to come on Law and Crime to talk about this case. I want to start with what we know about when police responded to Norma Caraker's house. And her son is there. He says there was, some unknown person who ran in and ran out. And police seemed little suspect about whether that story carried weight. What stood out to you about just the initial crime scene and what Neil Howard was telling the authorities?
Well, I think what was something that really turned the influence to the law enforcement officers who were there was the fact that he called. She was in her condition, dead, and he was drunk. And that was a huge kind of thing that I think really sparked up the way they would investigate it. And also the fact that he said someone else left, yet the door was locked where the person supposedly left out of.
Right, because you would think if someone was running from a house, they wouldn't stop and then, be a good neighbor and lock the door for somebody when they're off and running. The defense has made an argument that DNA wasn't taken from this scene for 15 months until after the murder. And then when the DNA came back, it did not match the suspect. In your experience, how much should that have factored in to how this case was tried?
Well, I think that's such an interesting question because it's so unusual, but it's happening more now with cases. I've actually seen it where there were cases when they weren't doing DNA and they finally did do DNA 15, 20 years later and saw that the DNA didn't match. That's something that could be very helpful on an appeal here because of the fact that that wasn't totally investigated or seen. However, though, without knowing all the other evidence that was had of whether or not that would become sort of something irrelevant in the sense that anybody could use a cord or something like that where they touched it previously and their DNA is on it, it doesn't mean their DNA was put on it the date that it happened or this thing occurred where she was strangled.
Well, like DNA, it is so new in the grand scheme of things. In your experience, I mean, is it every police department? Does every law enforcement agency have the tools to be able to gather DNA and then be able to test it in every single case? Because this happened in a pretty small town, about a half hour outside of St. Louis. So it, very much not in the complete middle of nowhere, but it's a place where you wonder if police even had the tools to be able to gather DNA.
Yeah, I do believe so, especially with the way technology is and the way labs are and things of that nature, that it isn't very difficult to collect or to test, and you don't have to send it to somewhere exactly in your area. You can send it wherever in that state that they're going to be able to do the testing and see where it goes.
And for you as well, like when you look at this case and if you were to try it, what would your argument be in trying to defend Neil Howard?
Well, the one thing would be I think a strong argument is the fact that he did call the police to report it. And you would be able to make a pretty strong argument to the jury that if someone committed a murder, why would they be calling the police and not just trying to get out of the place? So that would be something I think would be very strong in a defense. However, we don't know what the other evidence is, but the fact also that there's DNA of someone else that she had a relationship with, I think that would be strengthening it and strengthening the reason of why he called. Because why would he call if he committed the murder?
And that's part that I keep thinking about because we don't have all the cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom. This is something really from news reports from this part of Illinois that we've been able to follow and kind of understand how it would piece together. But why would police not seem to investigate the person that she was with the night that all of this happened?
That's something that really is a big question because of the fact you would think, the burden of proof is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And just the conversation we're having shows there is some doubt as to where these evidential factors came into before this jury and how they used them to convict him. But I do think the one thing that may be overwhelming is the fact of his intoxication at the time and the fact that he declared that someone went out of that door and the door was locked when the police came there. So if they left, how would they lock it? And also, I'd wonder why they wouldn't test that door for either fingerprints to see if they match somebody or DNA, just like they did the test on the cord that was used to strangle her.
Yeah, it seems really interesting. Just some of the holes where it appears that they did get a conviction, and then there are some pieces of evidence that points to them. But then at the same time, like to your point, like I mean, we're having the conversation of like, well, did they look here? Did they look there? Do you find that jurors? I mean, yes, it's the burden and the proofs on the prosecution to prove that it happened, but in reality, when you are a defense attorney, do you find that it's an uphill battle, even in circumstantial cases, to get the jury to believe your client?
I do think that, but that also just may be the being a trial attorney. You always got to overthink everything to make sure you're going in the right direction. But the very fact that I do think that jurors understand that there was a preponderance of the evidence that brought the charges, and now that the government has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, I do think though they do get a feeling that even though they're supposed to have their assumption as to innocence until it meets that burden, that they wonder why is this person sitting here if they didn't do it and why were they arrested. So I do think it is more difficult than it's read about.
What's your reaction, just having discussed, and we've been on before. I mean, we've talked about some difficult cases, and this one it's a bungee cord in a very kind of intimate death, and whoever did it, jury found that Neil Howard did it to his own mom. Just what's your reaction to the manner of death that this woman had?
It's very scary because the fact is it seems like it was a kind of emotional type of murder where someone would have lost their control in the situation. What's interesting too, though, is there are family members who believe he didn't do it, and I think that is really interesting. And I would like to have more information as to whether or not they thought of calling them as witnesses. Did they call them as witnesses and things of that nature? Because sometimes if you put forth a defense with testimony as opposed to just attacking whether or not the government met their burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that could hurt credibility as well if those witnesses aren't very strong.
How effective do you find character witnesses to be, where it's someone who wasn't in the house the night that it happened? They, had as much access to what happened as everybody else on the outside, but they at least know the people who were involved. How effective can that be in trying to get the jury on your side?
Well, I always think that if you can get a character witness or something where it has strength, it can bring the jury onto your side because they are now listening with some more credibility because there's just more than one piece of evidence. There's another witness saying that what occurred and the person who did something is someone we should trust and someone who you're alleging didn't do it because they have a good character and they're not a person who would do something like this.
What does the and the defense has said after this verdict that they plan to appeal it. What does the appeals process, I mean, clearly it has to be more than just, I didn't like how the verdict ended up, but how do you plan that appeal process? What does that actually look like?
Well, the appeal process is very difficult because you now have to show that there were some mistakes being made in the trial itself, that there were things that were admitted into evidence that shouldn't have been because it caused a prejudice to the jury to believe that this person was guilty when it should have never been admitted into evidence. And that's usually the strongest arguments you would like to have if you're appealing a case. In a case like this, you'd also want to see, why wasn't there more forensic evidence taken and more testing done? And the very fact that there was DNA shown on the alleged murder weapon, which was just a cord, that should have been further investigated and should have been done prior to the trial, not afterward. And the fact it was done afterward and shows that this person DNA wasn't on it, I think is a very strong argument for at least a reversal and to have it sent back for a retrial.
When you are, defending your client, when does the strategy of what an appeal will look like begin? Does that happen before the verdict?
That really depends, quite frankly, but sometimes it does happen before the verdict because there's pretrial motions, motions you make that the judge may deny or may grant, things of that nature. And also, it comes during the process of the trial where something, it's very, as much as people may think it's scripted, a trial, it's really not, because you really just have some boundaries. But when people get up and testify, things can change, answers can change. It could be not like what you expected, and things of that nature. So you have to be very aware in the present moment as to what's going on if you want to effectively represent a client.
How long does an appeal typically take? I mean, if you're going to appeal this verdict and you're going to try to find some, even if you have, let's just say the defense is able to find a piece of evidence that can lead to a new trial, what type of timeline are they looking at?
That depends on the state and the situation. It could take years. It could take a couple of years. Sometimes it could take under a year. It just really depends. And it also depends on the amount that you're appealing and the points you're appealing. So if it's very complicated, it could take quite a bit of time. And also, what people need to realize too is when you appeal, the side who loses could still go to the Supreme Court of that state. So another level. So it could take years to have this thing done.
Why does it take so long?
I think because of the fact that there are so many different courts going to, like I'm a Jersey guy. In New Jersey, we have different counties. So there's all these different counties within the state, and you have to go to the state appeals court. So they're getting a whole bunch of cases. And a lot of time appeals aren't just in criminal cases, they're in civil cases as well. So there's a backup. And I know since the pandemic, there's still a backup from way back then. Still, things have not gotten to be heard as soon as they had wished to be.
And then just looking at this case, and it's just, I mean, it's shocking. I mean, this was a man who's convicted of killing his own mom in an incredibly gruesome fashion for not wanting her to go out dating. Apparently, money was an issue as well. How can, and every case is unique. I mean, these are real people's lives, and a woman lost her life here. But what stands out to you just with the details that we were given of this case? And I guess compared to other murders you've seen, I mean, how common is it that you would have someone, I guess, kill their own mom? It just, to me, it's so shocking in the way that it was done.
Yeah, it is a shocking thing. And it's, I mean, I've heard of it before, but it's not something you really see too much of. And actually, as you're saying that, you brought something into my mind, which is that you really have to worry that if someone is actually killing their parent, their actual parent, that there has to be some sort of mental health issue that occurred that made them lose their respect and love for that person. And it seems that that occurred here. And it appears that he had some drinking issues and things of that nature. So that may have all been a heavy weigh in as to proof as to him committing the murder.
And I know that this is a story. I mean, this happened in Illinois, and every state is a little different. But he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. He will have to serve the 30 years in prison. He'll be an old man, 76 years old, if he's still alive at the time that his prison sentence ended. Why, in some states, when you see a case like this, that he would be sentenced to that as opposed to just life in prison?
Well, that's because a lot of times what they have is a minimum mandatory. And sometimes it's like 25 to 30, 25 or 36 years, where it's a minimum mandatory if you go to trial. And I think sometimes what they do is they have that because the people will realize it's not worth taking the risk of going to trial if you're actually guilty, if you could get a plea below the mandatory minimum and work out the case in that way.
And this is just it's a shocking case. It's a sad case. This was a woman who was definitely beloved in her small community, and one that a case that definitely shocked it. And we'll see how the appeals process plays out. Michael Korobanix, it's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be on. Thank you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.